I'm Alex, this is Technical Gaming, and Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order grinds my gears. Now, I'm a Dark Souls guy. I fell in love with the first Dark Souls game after a lot of trial and error with it. You know, I played it a bunch, I couldn't really get into it, and then one day it just clicked. I got past the Gargoyles boss, and the rest was history. You know, I was hooked, basically. And ever since then, I have been a huge fan of the quality of Dark Souls games. Dark Souls 1, 3, Sekiro, like all of the mainline Dark Souls titles have been fantastic. Bloodborne's great. Dark Souls 2 was a bit of a miss for me because while it did a lot to accurately portray the Dark Souls experience, it felt like a fan-made game. Like it felt like mechanically it had everything going for it, but it had a lot of crutches and a lot of level design and enemy design that was just, it didn't seem like a real Dark Souls game. And while, you know, that might be a blight on the Dark Souls franchise for some people like me, for others it's fine, no big deal. And by and large, the Dark Souls franchise is the most well-regarded like third-person melee combat game there is. You know, everyone kind of respects Dark Souls for the punishing melee game that it is, or the you know, franchise, whatever. And so when another game like The Surge or the Fallen Gods or whatever that game was, when other games claim to be in the same vein as Dark Souls, you know, Dark Souls-like, so to speak, often the expectation is either the game is going to live up to that expectation, which they never seem to do, or it's going to fail in dramatic fashion for a variety of reasons that are seemingly obvious but incredibly nuanced in reality. And I'm happy to say that Fallen Order, by and large, blends the best of two worlds. It blends the design and aesthetic and wonderful backstory of Star Wars with the meaningful and well-paced and well-thought-out and well-designed combat that you would find in a game like Dark Souls. There are some rough edges, and there are some things that I want to talk about in terms of the combat and the level design, but I'm going to steer away from spoilers, steer away from story content. So if you're here for that stuff, I mean, that stuff, the story especially, is pretty solid, and I'll touch on it briefly without spoiling it as we go on, but I'm not really here to talk at length about my feelings on the game's story or how I think the game is as a whole. I want to talk more specifically about some gameplay element stuff. Now, I will say the game is beautiful. You're going to see as soon as the game loads up, pretty much any point in time, you could take a frame from this video and it's going to look gorgeous. This game is a visual marvel, but I have performance issues with it. I don't know if it's unique to me. I know it's being reported fairly widely, like not extensively. And let's travel to a planet to make our first point, which is about the world design. But the performance issues are a real problem. When they hit, which seems to be totally random. Like at first I thought, oh, it's because there's so much happening on screen. The performance is tanking, but then the performance would stay tanked, and then it would improve, and then it would get bad again. And there has been a patch since I started playing the game, and I don't know if it's addressed any of these issues or not. But what I can say is that when the performance issues hit, if they hit for you at all, that is, it will impact gameplay. Like, you will not be able to input actions. If you hit a button, the action will not register. Your action just gets completely canceled when these frame drops hit. And it can really be a problem. So if you have performance issues, leave your thoughts in the comments below about them. And hopefully the developers will address them in a patch if they haven't already by the time this video makes it out. Now, the first thing that I think is working against this game is the world design. This is the first real planet you visit in terms of areas to explore. And it's a pretty decently sized area. Like, it serves as mostly a tutorial for environmental navigation, but it's on the smaller side. Like, there are much bigger areas to explore, but they all have the same problem. I don't know if you've noticed this, but this is the starting point. And this big tower over here is basically the end point. You know, it's the farthest place you will go in this level, basically. I just swallowed a fly. Holy shit. The thing is, it's a very linear level. You know, there is a distinct start and end point with a bunch of stuff in the middle. And you spend a lot of time going from the beginning of a place to the end of a place, and then going back to that world later on in the game to explore other side areas. Like, you'll see all these little yellow markers on the map. These are areas that I can now explore based on the abilities that I have unlocked through progressing through the game. You know, as you play, you unlock new abilities and new things that your character is capable of, like jumping farther, scaling up walls that you couldn't scale before, hacking things, etc. And so as you gain these new powers, like, you don't gain them all at once in every world. Like, every world has barriers that you have to go elsewhere to unlock the skills to get around. And so when you come back to revisit, you know, backtrack through these areas, the fact that there is no fast travel between the save points, that the maps are super linear, and that once you get to the end point, there isn't always a loop around shortcut that's already taken you back to the beginning. Like, that is the thing I think that Dark Souls has done really well, and that if you start in one area and you go to the next logical area of progression, by the time you get through that next area of progression, you've either made a complete circuit back to where you started in that level or the starting world in general, or you've made it to another place that's very meaningful and that you should continue progressing through. Like, you never get to the end and then that's the end of the level and then you have to go back and then go to a new area. It's always an interconnected loop that you're going through, even if you're not looping back to the start of the game every single circuit, if that makes any sense. But in this game, you go to the end of the level and then you're like, okay, time to go. And then you have to walk all the way back to the ship. And that's not a huge problem. You know, there is a lot to explore. Like, right now doing this, I just completely went into a new area that I haven't been in before. And it would have been impossible for me to get here until I've basically gotten to this point in the game's story, in this point in the game's progression. You know, I've unlocked several planets, and one of them gave me the jump ability that lets me jump these gaps. And so in terms of like getting to re-explore old areas and, oh, that was dumb.
There must be a nest around here somewhere.
That was a hint at the performance issues that I was mentioning. Bye-bye. When it comes to, you know, backtracking, you do find meaningful things. Like, it's not just like, oh, now you can go unlock a new chest that has a prettier item in it. It's, you can go and unlock a whole new area that gives you new abilities, new skill points, new cosmetic items, all kinds of interesting stuff that in playing the game before you didn't have access to. And so that's nice, but that is the thing I think Dark Souls has excelled in over other comparable titles, in that you can just explore to your heart's content and you never feel like you're constantly retreading the same ground you've walked on 1,000 times. And that can be very frustrating in games when they're focused on always making progress or progressing the story or getting to a new place or experiencing new things. And that's in large part what this game is all about. It's all about, you know, discovering your character and discovering new worlds and people along the way and stuff. And so to constantly have this feeling like you are on a linear path that you have to go both ways on to get anywhere important, it is a little frustrating. It's tedium. You know, it's a tedium that is the result of the way the game is designed. And so I'm not here to say that, like, oh, the developers have massively screwed up in their world design. Like, that's really not the point of what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that I think the developers, much like every other developer that has made a Dark Souls-like game without being the developers of Dark Souls, they've made a small error in that they're forcing players to backtrack constantly, when what they should have done is design the world in such a way that backtracking isn't required. You know, if you're gonna design the game so that backtracking is an important element of the core gameplay, you should also make it not feel like you're constantly trudging the same ground over and over again. So I don't think the game is bad or anything for having this issue. Like it's a common issue, but I think it's just another indication of what makes Dark Souls as a franchise so beloved compared to games that try to be like it. And again, it's not a big deal. I think by and large, you spend most of your time playing this game and enjoying the experience. It's not like it takes away dramatically from the game itself. On that note, though, we can talk a little bit about the combat, I guess. So I'll get to an area of the game with a bit more going on in terms of combat, and then we can discuss how the game shapes up combat-wise compared to other games like Dark Souls. So before we get to gameplay, I just wanted to highlight one thing, and I think this ties in actually to gameplay. When you're in the ship, you can't run. A lot of games make this mistake where the developers are like, okay, we've come to a situation or a part of the game where doing X, Y, or Z is not optimal. You know, if a player was able to run in the ship, they might find navigating the ship's narrow corridors difficult because the running mechanics are designed for the open world environments. You know, it's designed to move quickly across big spaces, and when you put the player in a small space like this, it can kind of break the flow of gameplay. What makes Dark Souls stand apart in a lot of ways when it comes to gameplay from games that try to copy it or mimic it is that Dark Souls will let you sprint in the narrow corridor, even if it's a bad idea. Dark Souls will let you walk off a cliff, even if it's a bad idea. Those games will let you do things that are 100% bad ideas and you shouldn't do, but it lets you do them so that you can learn not to do them without taking away your ability to do things that you're familiar with or that you expect your character to be capable of doing. And a lot of times in the gameplay for this game, that's the feeling you get. You know, you are a Jedi, and while at the start of the game you don't have all of your abilities, you do have a lightsaber, you do have the ability to use the Force in some degree. You'd expect to be able to just like run, jump, and gallop everywhere that you can see. And the game uses wall running and double jumping and swinging on vines as like a roadblock to getting from place to place, or from doing those things that you would expect your character would be able to do right off the bat. Ultimately, what I think it comes down to is the gameplay in this game is solid. It's fantastic. You know, they hit all the right notes in conveying a Star Wars experience, while at the same time, I think they've done a great job of not making it a power fantasy game. You know, I think that is the big mistake that a lot of Star Wars games make, is that they just go straight into the Jedi power fantasy. You know, you're this super badass Jedi Knight that can do anything, can leap tall buildings, can throw their lightsaber and just like melt people. And the game avoids this by making the combat considered and slow, and you have to be careful, and you can't just hack and slash your way through every single enemy. And then they throw in boss fights where you're going up against bosses that have area of effect attacks and stuff that are, kind of a little bit on the more cartoony side. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. I think it works really well as a Star Wars experience, but I think in a lot of ways, the potential for this game to be more than just another Star Wars game was kind of laid bare. You know, it is really obvious that the developers understand what makes the combat and general gameplay of Dark Souls so meaningful and engaging with the average player, or people that enjoy those games. That guy fell. I love doing this. Bye. And what makes these cartoony boss fights even more frustrating is that while they're big, scary animals or whatever, and it kind of makes sense that they would break the conventions of other boss fights against more human-like enemies, at the same time, the game expertly nails what it's like to fight against like the AT-ATs and stuff, and that while it's this big gargantuan boss, there are specific mechanics that you can use to defeat it, and they don't have these sort of outlandish or cartoony abilities that make them more threatening than they really are. You know, this bird owl bat thing that I'm fighting on screen now, it has all of these crazy attacks that are like AoE based, and it's like you're getting attacked by a giant animal. In other situations where you're fighting big things, they fight in a predictable way. Like the at walkers are like the little tiny walkers that you fight. Like they could step on you, but you manage to avoid it, and they seem more interested in hurting you than letting you get under them. So it seems a little more grounded. Whereas you're fighting a gigantic bat, why doesn't it just sit on you? Like, you know what I mean? Like it's not so much that the fight itself is problematic. It's that the abilities that they give this particular boss just seem cartoony when they've demonstrated so clearly that they can nail a grounded big boss fight experience in other areas of the game. You know, like when you're playing Dark Souls, right? You'll go up against like a giant boss. You get one shot, and if you screw up that shot, you have to start from scratch, and eventually you achieve like the perfect run of that boss and you beat it. And you're not beating it because, you know, you have all these crazy abilities and you're just tanking through the fight. You're beating it because you're figuring out the attack patterns and you're figuring out the elements that make a run without dying possible. And so Fallen Order, the moment-to-moment gameplay is very much rooted in that same philosophy. You know, you're not just running through enemies. You're using your tools and your abilities in a way that makes you win those fights in that specific instance. But then they throw in bosses that have the cartoony AoE attacks and elements you've seen in previous Star Wars games like Force Unleashed, and you're just like, yeah, but this kind of takes away from all of the gameplay elements and stuff that I've become familiar with in playing the game. So let's talk about the skill tree real quick before we continue any further. As you can see, I have unlocked pretty much almost every skill there is to unlock. And I'm about 2/3 of the way through the game, and I've been doing a lot of side quests. All of your core abilities, like your ability to use a double-bladed lightsaber to force push and pull enemies, stuff like that, like the major abilities, you unlock through the story. But it robs the skill tree of sort of that interesting diversity that you would find in other games. Dark Souls is probably not the best example because your skills in that game, like your moveset, is determined by the weapons you find rather than the attributes you upgrade. But in this game, it really feels like you're just ticking off boxes on an attribute tree. Like some of these abilities are just like if they just add an extra combo or new damage potential to an existing attack that you've been using since the start. Like all the attacks are very timing based in this game. So you're really just expanding on the number of buttons you can push to do certain moves. You're never really going to unlock an ability. Like I think the most dramatic ability that you can unlock that isn't found through the story is the ability to throw your lightsaber, which I haven't even bothered unlocking yet, but it seems really useful. It's just 3 skill points, and I don't feel like spending them when I could get things like the improved dash strike, which is really powerful, the ability to deflect laser blasts while running and sprinting. Like there are a lot of abilities that are important and do seem like they're worth getting. But at the same time, you're not going to unlock like a new version of force push that also emits lightning and does fire damage or something. Like there is a little bit of a lack of experimentation made possible by this sort of basic skill tree that I would like to see expanded on. Like it'd be cool if you maxed out one of the lightsaber tree or the survival tree. It would unlock another tree of modifiers that you can put skill points into that either give you flat upgrades or give you upgrades with some downsides. Like your lightsaber burns enemies when struck with a critical hit, but you take 10% extra damage when you get critical hit. And interestingly, it almost looks like the skill tree expands further. You know, based on the save point menu here, it looks like in the distance, there's other skill trees that you can progress through and unlock stuff in. And I don't know if like this game's going to get DLC content that adds new skill trees, or if there's a replay mode like an NG Plus mode where the skill tree keeps going or something. It doesn't seem like there is, and it doesn't seem like that's the case in general, but it really seems like kind of a wasted opportunity to have a much more interesting and branched out skill set or skill tree available to the player. Now, the thing is, the game seems fairly short. Most people see these are the performance issues I'm talking about. When this starts happening, your gameplay just goes to doo-doo. Like, look at this. It's so bad, and I don't know what causes it. Like my computer, if I pull up the metrics on my computer right now, you can see GPU's at like, 80, 90%, CPU's barely even being touched. RAM, I have 32 gigs of RAM. My GPU has 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Like I'm not maxing out my computer really at all, but the game just starts stuttering like that and it drives me nuts. With the game being so brief, like I'm 2/3 of the way through it and I've been playing for I think like 10 or 15 hours. And most people, it seems like most people beat the game in about, I would say 20 hours if they're doing a lot of side stuff. And I have been playing for about 10 or 15 hours. And I think there isn't a whole lot of actual combat in that 10 to 15 hours that I've played so far. Like going through each world, yeah, there's a lot of fighting stormtroopers and stuff, but there's also a lot of this stuff, like just running through areas and parkouring. And that's part of what makes the backtracking feel so tedious, is that a large part of the game is spent just traveling. I could have avoided that. Bye. And I think that is part of why the skill tree is so limited, is because if the game had a more expansive or dramatic skill tree, the game would also have to be like another 10 or 15 hours long for you to make any real use out of it. Because by the time you've gotten most of the abilities that I've already unlocked, the game is just like, it's open to you. You've oh God, this is going poorly because like my button presses, half of them aren't even registering right now. So I really hope they sort this issue out soon. But I think that is kind of a double-edged sword, right? Like having, no pun intended, by the way, having the game be so brief in a lot of ways limits the ability of the game to offer a lot of depth. I mean, this game is also gorgeous. So yeah. What's my conclusion here? Well, I don't think the game is a bad imitation of Dark Souls at all. I think it's actually a really good homage to what makes Dark Souls games so fantastic. And I like performance issues and my problems with the world design and the gameplay stuff, all that aside, I think at the end of the day, this is like the best Star Wars game that they've made since the first Force Unleashed game, which was a really surprisingly good action adventure game set in the Star Wars universe. Like it had a decent story, the action set pieces were really engaging, but I don't think we've ever had a Star Wars game with this kind of complexity and nuance to its gameplay. Like most of the Star Wars games just fall into that action adventure category of like Uncharted with a lightsaber, and it can get kind of just like arcadey and not very fulfilling at the end of the day. And this game does what those games fail to do, which is offer a compelling and engaging gameplay loop that rewards skill and patience and timing over just being a badass Jedi with a good lightsaber. The problem is some of the boss fights and some of the more set piecey moments really distract and detract from that core design. And then you throw in the world design being a little too linear and not looping in on itself enough, and the lack of depth in the skill tree and stuff like that, and it kind of mars the overall product. But I don't think it's too bad. Like I don't think the game is unplayable or anything. Like I don't think it's bad by any stretch. I think it could be a lot more interesting and a lot deeper, but the developers weren't necessarily going for an exact one-to-one remake of Dark Souls. They were going for an accessible but engaging and interesting game set in the Star Wars universe. And I think they've succeeded in large part in doing that. Like I think the game, by and large, really nails the Star Wars aesthetic, as I, stand with one foot on the back of a stormtrooper looking at a waterfall cascading over an icy rock face with a destroyed Star Destroyer or something in the background. Like, they have 100% nailed the Star Wars aesthetic. Look at this. I use my lightsaber as a flashlight. This is something no Dark Souls game has done well, using actual light as a gameplay mechanic. Like, oh, it's so good. It's so good. I love it. And so I think in a lot of ways, Respawn have fundamentally nailed what this game should be. And it's a joy to play. And these performance issues aside, I am super, super pleased with the way the game has come out. And I really hope that this inspires other developers to be a little bit more bold and risky with Star Wars, because until now, every Star Wars game I've ever played has been very safe. It's never been like you're going to die a bunch, and that's just the way it is. There's never been a Star Wars game where like timing and patience and mastering your moveset have been like predominant factors in how well you play the game. And that's exactly what this game is. It is, you got to learn how to play the game effectively if you want to be effective in it. And you can certainly turn down the difficulty, and I honestly think that there should be a few more difficulty options below story, because I have some friends that have struggled to play the game or enjoy the game even on the story mode difficulty because of some of the elements of it. But by and large, I think they nailed it. I think this is a ringing endorsement of the game in a lot of ways, and I just want you to understand that, like, as a Dark Souls player, yeah, they could have done more. But as someone that just enjoys video games in general and understands that what this game is trying to do, it's not trying to be the Dark Souls of Star Wars. It's trying to be a Star Wars game that borrows elements from Dark Souls to tell a compelling story. And I think they nailed it. Anyway, I'm Alex. This has been Technical Gaming. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for future content. Thank you for watching. And also, yeet!